for Transferring Learning from One Learning Experience to the Next. Our presenter will be Kate Roberts. Kate is a national literacy consultant, top-selling author, and popular keynote speaker. She taught reading and writing in Brooklyn, New York, and worked as a literacy coach before joining the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project in 2005, where she worked as lead staff developer for 11 years. Please don't forget to tweet in hashtag the EdCloud Gathering, and we are in session 4. So I'll hand it over to Kate.
Fantastic. Hi, everybody. It's really good to be here. As is life, this morning our childcare canceled, which we thought we were so responsible for booking for the day. And so, as many of you know, my wife Maggie is presenting next session. And so she is wrangling the children outside. So if they're screaming, you will know why they're screaming. I'm hoping kind of for a BBC moment. Maggie's practiced the body language she should use if she's falling into the room trying to chase after our kids coming in. So I'm really excited to be talking about this topic of transferring learning from one experience to another. It is born out of struggle, which has been sort of recently my favorite work, is figuring out things that aren't going well in my teaching, and trying to figure out some ways that maybe I can make it better. And, you know, I got to a point in my teaching where, you know, on the whole, like day to day, I didn't feel like my lessons were that bad. Like, I mean, I had some that were better than others, right? I had some lessons that I wish someone would come in and see and film, and others that I'm like, thank goodness no one is here to witness this. But like on the whole, if you looked at my teaching across a unit or across a week, you know, I would look at the lessons that I taught. I would even look at the unit that I had, you know, hopefully co-designed with people. And I would say like, yeah, those lessons seem pretty good. And at the end of a unit, I would even feel like I could look at the student work that kids had made, right, had gone through, either their reading or their writing in my case. And I would be proud of them. Like I could look at the stuff that they'd written and the work that they'd done in their books, and I could like give them high fives and feedback. They were giving each other feedback where I felt like this is good stuff that we just did. And then that unit would end and the next unit would begin, or the next day would happen. They'd pick up the next book in their reading life. And what I would notice is that I didn't see, in many cases, the work that we had just done for, say, 4 weeks of time. I didn't see that work sort of transfer in to the next learning experience that they did. And this happened like regardless of the time break. And maybe you guys can relate to this, or maybe you can't. You know, certainly from year to year, right? Like I would teach, or I knew that I had colleagues who were teaching them literary essay skills in 7th grade, and then the kids would get to me in 8th grade. And sometimes that first day of lit essay felt like a reintroduction to the unit, right? Like, what's a literary essay? And there were sort of crickets. But then it also would happen across my year where, you know, I would teach, let's just stick with the essay analogy. I would teach an essay unit in the fall, and then I would do another one, or kids would have to do one on demand for somebody, me or a social studies teacher or a test. And they wouldn't necessarily carry that experience that we'd had, like the level of writing that they had done with me, I wasn't seeing in this second essay. So it happened like across years that kids weren't transferring their learning. It happened across the year with me, where we would do something once, and then I wouldn't see that same level or quality of work in their next piece or book that they were reading. But then it sometimes happened even like across the day, right? Like my best teacher friend when I was in the classroom was a social studies teacher down the hall. And, you know, I would teach, say, like a main idea strategy period 1. And, you know, I would like see her in the hallway and I'd be like, hey, I taught this lesson. And the kids would go into her room and she'd be like, let's do the same thing Miss Roberts taught you in this history text. And again, to be glib, the kids would just kind of be like, the what? Right? Like the who? Main idea? I never heard of it. So it feels like this is an issue that is problematic for me that I haven't necessarily figured out how to solve. But it's one that I've done some work around with lots of smart people to kind of think, well, what could we do to sort of think about ways of transferring learning? Like, all right, we just had this nonfiction reading experience. What is it that you're going to do? Like, how are you going to show that you know how to do those same skills in another place? So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey of some of the steps and strategies and structures that we've set up for kids to try to help them to transfer what they've learned. But the first thing, before we sort of get into steps or strategies, is that I have to look, I think, and this is a big passion of mine recently, I have to look at what I'm teaching, if I'm teaching a unit or I'm teaching over a course of time. And I have to ask myself, I think, when are kids going to be practicing this again? That if I'm going to spend 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks sometimes, right, like on this one set of skills or this one kind of reading or writing work that I want kids to have experience with, I don't know. I mean, it's worth it, right? In the big way, it's worth it. But man, it would feel even better if I knew my kids were going to be practicing this work again. So I teach Lit Essay in September. When very quickly are the kids going to be able to use these same skills and strategies in their school life or their writing life? And so a couple options there, you know, in terms of thinking through that. One, if you're in a departmentalized school, or even if you're not and you have some control over the curriculum and the other subject areas, is that we can always have kids, you know, do it again in another subject area. And that's a great way to sort of look across our curriculum or get together with colleagues and be like, hey, I think I'm going to teach these things in October. Is there anyone here who can have the kids practice it again in November or December? And this is something that Mary Aaronworth at the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project taught me to think through with people. That like, if you're going to teach something, and the image that she gave me that I use is like, if I'm going to lift these skills up off the ground, right, which is my job as a reading and a writing teacher, it's my job to teach the skills, to say nonfiction reading, here we go, literary essay, poetry, whatever it is. So I'm going to lift that up off the ground, and it's going to be a heavy lift, right? I'm going to have to use methods and conferences and tools and all this stuff to get these skills up off the ground. If I can then hand that skill to another colleague or subject area in my day or in my building, so the kids can then just like go from the experience with me to just sort of roll into social studies or science or art or math and be able to then do it again, that's only going to help reinforce the learning that they just had with me. And so in some schools that I've worked with, we'll take out our year-long curriculum, again, whether it's all me doing the teaching in the room or whether I have colleagues in the building who are taking on the teaching. And we'll just do some thinking about like, all right, how many times could kids practice some of these core ways of reading or core ways of writing so that they can transfer what they've learned from my class and they don't have to wait like 3 months to do it, right? So one thing to think about, I think, when we want to track sort of where our teaching is going long-term, like beyond that last day of the unit, is to make sure that we've set something up in our curriculum or in the building where kids are going to do it again. Repeated practice is the jam, I think. You know, I'm humbled, I think, at this stage in my career, 20 years in, I am humbled by how much repetition human beings need to really learn something. Way more usually than I want it to, way more than I could even fathom. Even when I know people need repetition, boy, they need about 5 times as much repetition than I think. If what I really want is for people to learn it kind of, you know, the phrase you hear a lot is like in their bones, right? That they don't have to think about it. There's an automaticity to the learning. It's right at their fingertips. So the first way we would do that is to look across our year and make sure that if I lift these skills up off the ground in lit essay, in nonfiction reading, in narrative reading, in poetry reading, in graphic novel writing, that I'm going to be able to hand it to someone or to another part of my teaching so that the kids can apply it one more time, two more times as the year goes on. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing then is that I think that if I want to teach my kids to transfer their learning, it's going to help me if I'm really clear and explicit with what it is that I'm asking them to get better at or to transfer. Let me back up a little bit and explain what I mean by that. Let's take a nonfiction reading unit that maybe you teach in your building or in your district. Oftentimes, a nonfiction reading unit will take, let's say it's 3 weeks. Maybe yours is longer, maybe yours is shorter, but let's say it's 3 weeks long to cut the difference. In that unit, so often what I'll see, and I mean this units I've written, so I'm certainly not judging anyone's units, that when I write a unit, what I tend to do is I'll say, okay, we're going to do nonfiction reading. At the beginning of this unit, I'm going to teach kids something about how to determine importance and take notes, right? Okay, we're going to spend a couple days on that. Then we're going to move on and we're going to do some main idea and supporting detail work because like that's obviously really important. Cool, we're going to do that. Okay, so that's going to be 3 days. Okay, now we're going to teach kids to synthesize ideas across the text. And then, we got to teach analyzing craft moves, right? Especially, for bias. So we have to do a couple of days of bias and point of view. And, geez, the test has that structure stuff. Got to get a couple days of structure teaching in there too. Okay, so structure, we'll add a couple days of structure. And then, I'd love them to compare. You get the idea? So here we are 3 weeks in, 4 weeks into our nonfiction reading unit. And what I'm teaching kids is to do everything a nonfiction reader does. And there's worth in that, right? Like, I think it's good for kids to get a sense of, hey, to be a nonfiction reader, here's the arc of nonfiction skills that you want to encounter and dabble in. But the problem to me is that if all of my units take that course of, okay, you're going to have 3 weeks, 4 weeks. We're going to start off with these skills, then we're going to move to these skills, then we're going to move to these skills, then we're going to end with these skills. That I think it's hard for young people. It would be hard for me to know and to be able to articulate to myself, what is it that I'm supposed to be like actually practicing here, right? Or really getting better at. Many of you might have heard me say this. I say it a lot right now, but like one question that I'm obsessed by recently looking at curriculum is the question of, in this unit, what am I going to teach versus what am I going to cover? And I think that's an important distinction. I will always cover material, right? Like there's too much, and covering is good. It's invitations, it's experience. Some kids will hold on to that stuff. I remember I had one lesson on critical reading in high school, and I still remember it to this day. I'm so glad my teacher covered critical reading. But that is different than being able to identify a skill or set of skills that I really want to teach my kids. Because teaching denotes repetition, differentiation, maybe making tools, right? Like the stuff that I'm really going to pull small groups around and confer around. And I think that when I'm looking at this question of transferring learning from one experience to another, like, all right, I've taught you nonfiction reading, now transfer that learning. I think it's really going to help kids if I've whittled down a little bit that list of skills that I'm trying to get them to transfer. And then instead, I identify a really clear skills focus for this unit that I can articulate to my kids and say, in this unit, in this X amount of weeks, what I know is that you are going to be better main ideas. Not that that's a word, but you get the idea, right? Or you're going to be better elaborators of essay. You guys are pretty good at structuring essays and writing sort of a 5-paragraphy thing. And this unit, I'm going to make sure that you're better at saying more each step of the way and developing these parts of your essay. So if one big piece of transferring learning from one experience to another is being able to make sure that kids do it again, otherwise, how could they transfer? The second big piece of transferring their learning is being able to make sure that they don't have to transfer everything there is to transfer about that kind of reading or writing. That I'm saying, you know, right now in 6th grade and 3rd grade and 9th grade and 10th grade, whatever you're teaching, I want you to really zoom in on this skill. And that can take some doing. One thing that I like to think about, it's really anxiety provoking for me to look at a unit of study and look at a group of kids and decide what the skills focus is going to be. It feels a little like playing God. But it helps if I can think about skills, whether they're reading skills or writing skills, as being sort of part of a hierarchy, that there's an order to these skills, that like, while certainly to be a good reader or to be a good writer, you have to do all of these things, right, in concert. When I read a book, I infer, I envision, I read fluently, hopefully, I do some interpretation, I do a critical read, sort of all mishmashed together. At the same time, if I am unable to, say, monitor for sense and understand what I'm reading, then it doesn't really matter what I'm doing with my inferring work so much, right? Because it's like I'm not making sense of the text. So one thing I like to think about is, hold on, awkward pause. Okay, so one thing I like to think about is looking at these reading skills as if they are in order for a reason. That I can look at my kids, and in a reading unit, I can ask myself, all right, how good are my kids right now? Or really, how independent are my kids when they're monitoring for sense, or when they're practicing their fluency skills, or when they're envisioning, or inferring, or interpreting, or analyzing craft, or reading with critical lens. And then with writing, I can think what matters first really is that kids have meaning in their writing and a focus that drives their piece. That then they know sort of how that piece is going to go together, what the parts are, and what the genre conventions are. That then they're able to fill in those parts with words and details, that hopefully they're able to write with some craft and voice, and finally that they're able to do that with some conventions. Hold on. Stop sharing. I'm so super technical here. Okay, so one thing when we're thinking about what we want kids to transfer, before we get into the transfer piece of it, there's the repeated practice, but then there's also this idea of what is the focus that I want the kids to really hold on to, that I really want them to transfer. It probably can't be everything about lit essay if I expect to see greater independence. Because that's going to be too much of an ask, I think, for most kids. But I could say that you're going to be transferring this one piece of, say, nonfiction reading, or literary essay, or graphic novels, or what have you. So the next piece of that, as a reading workshop, a writing workshop person, I have a slight, very minor, I think, beneficial addiction. And that is that, like, the second that I mention a skill, like interpretation or thinking about theme, that I start to sort of get this insatiable hunger for strategies to make sure that kids can practice that skill. So if I want to transfer my learning from one piece to another, it's going to really help if I haven't just practiced that skill, but I've also articulated the really concrete strategies that I can use to practice it. And there's lots of ways to find those strategies. So if I think about the skill of interpretation, like, one thing you could do right now is to Google skills for interpreting texts, right? You could open up another window right now and just sort of see, what do you find online? You also can go to thoughtful PD books that teach you about those skills and strategies, whether that is books like, wow, I'm blanking, all the books that are out there that you should get. Like, I just am reading 180 Days, or Beyond Literary Analysis are the two reads on my stack. And those are helping me to understand both how to think about a year of high school curriculum, but then also the skill of literary analysis. And it's teaching me strategies to then teach my kids. Or Jen Sarabal's The Reading Strategies book, or the Writing Strategies book, which both give you a really accessible way to access strategies, but also we're going to do a little teaching inside of it. I've found time and time again where there's no one strategy that's the answer, but over and over again, I'm amazed how when I give a student a strategy that's going to unlock a skill for them, it is the key that unlocks the door. So I want to make sure I identify a skills focus, and then I want to make sure I have a bunch of strategies that I can give kids that I'm teaching them over there. So then I teach, right? I teach that unit. The unit has a skills focus. The unit has strategies that support that skill, that give kids concrete ways to practice the skill that I am hoping they will focus on and transfer later on. And now I've come to the place where the unit's over. I've done great teaching. Good job, me. And now they're going to go do it again, right? And maybe they're going to do it again in my class, or maybe they're going to do it again in social studies or in another class. But here now I'm at the point of actually being able to transfer what I've learned from one place to another. And it's a little silly to take so much time to talk about the point of transfer, but I think one of the things that gets in the way of kids being able to use what they've learned is that they're not really sure what it is they've learned. Like, they've done a lot of things with you, but they haven't sort of identified for themselves that thing that they're going to hold on to and say, I'm working on interpreting themes in text. So here we are. We're going to ask them to do it again. We've created another experience for practice for kids. And there are some things that I think will help kids to be able to transfer what they've learned. Because if I just offer the opportunity, some kids will take that opportunity. But I know there are a bunch of students who will politely decline the invitation to work rigorously on this next learning experience in the same way that they did when I was guiding them more clearly. So the first thing that I'll teach kids to do when they're transferring their learning from one experience to another is that they have to have reminders. It's been proven unreasonable for us as educators to ask kids to remember everything they've been taught. In grad school, I had to do a project where I chose a kid to follow all day long throughout their day. This was in middle school. And the one thing that was really humbling to me was following Cinquay across his day was the sheer amount that people expected he would be able to memorize. Everything from, you use blue or black pen in this class, it doesn't matter if you do in this class, to headings, to certainly the content and the skills that he was being taught. So when I'm asking kids to transfer, say, their strategies for interpreting a text from one text to another text, hopefully now with greater independence, it's not reasonable for me to ask that they're going to memorize all the strategies I taught them, particularly if any time has elapsed between the first learning experience and the second. So there's some things we can do to make sure that kids are set up for success in being able to transfer those experiences. And most of them are artifacts. My favorite is that if I've identified a skills focus for kids, and I know that I want them to practice interpreting text, is that I'm going to lean on the tool of the teaching chart to make sure that kids know and have a visual reminder of what it is they're going to practice when they go to their books. And the thing about charts is in Maggie and I's book, DIY Literacy, we talk a lot about charts, as do many other people. Rosalinder's Chart Sense and Christy Mraz and Marjorie Martinelli's Smarter Charts are great resources for charts in general. But I think charts sometimes are a somewhat misunderstood tool. Either we're charters, those of you listening here. You have charts in your room, you love charts, you like to make them, it's amazing. In my classroom, I was a charter, and I sometimes felt like my class was like a rainforest of beautiful charts that you would just sort of wade through as you entered the room. And that's great, right? I think that in some ways charts are a really good thing to have up. But I was challenged by one of my mentors who came into my room and looked at the charts and just kind of said, you know, Kate, these are really nice charts, but what is a chart? Which of these charts have you used with a student in the last 30 days? And my answer was that I hadn't used any of them. So for those of us who are charters, I think it's useful to remember that the number one reason why I chart is to increase student independence. And especially when I'm asking kids to transfer their learning from one unit to another or one day to another, a chart is going to really help them because they can look up and glance and get a reminder of what it is that they're supposed to be practicing. The other thing that charts tend to help with is that they help kids choose what it is that they're going to work on that's going to be the right fit for them as they're practicing the skill that you're asking them to transfer from one thing to another. So I love charts. Here's one interpreting one. Here's a character one. How do we think about characters and what they tell them about the kind of person? The friendlier, the kid-friendlier a chart can be, the better. But if I want kids to transfer their learning, I'm probably going to need to put something up that's going to help them remember what it is that they're supposed to be doing. And there's a lot of us who I know think this is like a no duh, but might do it in a different way. Like I know many of us have kids write down notes in their notebook and feel like, okay, well, they have it in their notebook. So when they go to practice this work again, they can just go and refer to the notes. And that's totally true. And I think if you teach into it, notebooks can work. And as kids get older, they will want to learn how to use notes effectively. At the same time, if my number one goal in my instruction is not teaching kids how to use their notes, but is teaching them to transfer the skill I taught in one area of my teaching into another, I would argue that it's very rare for kids without a ton of reminding and pushing and support to independently stop their work as they're going and go hold on a second. I'm struggling. I think there's a strategy I learned a month ago, right? Or last year or last unit or even yesterday. Let me open up my notebook and look for it. So if I've already identified a skill or a few skills that I want kids to transfer, and I have the strategies that I've taught them, it feels worth it to me to just get it up on a piece of chart paper so that kids can refer to it as they're working to remember to use it. So that's a big one. Other ones that are helpful is partners, whether it's writing partners or reading partners, anything that's available to help kids to just remember what it is that they're supposed to be practicing. Many educators are allergic to the word lazy, even though sometimes it's such a tempting word to throw out at kids. But I find over and over again that those kids who seem like they're dragging their feet and not wanting to work hard on something or apply something they learned in one place to another, it's not that they don't want to, it's just that their mind's kind of going blank. And if any of you have been in a learning experience where a teacher has asked you to just recall something, even though you know how to do it, there's still this way that moment of pressure of the blank page in front of you and someone saying remember we did this last week, where you're just kind of no, I don't got it. So a chart's going to help with that. The second thing that's going to help kids to transfer their learning across one experience to another is to have consistent check-ins and confirmations and guidance along the way. That a chart all by itself isn't going to be the thing that makes a difference, I think, in transferring kids' learning. I think it could help the kids who are already motivated to do that work, to remember what it is they could practice. But kids need you and they need each other to help them to understand whether they're on the right track or not. The often quoted researcher, John Hattie, looked at things that influence student growth. And one of the things he found was response, right? That getting feedback as you're doing something is really important. And he saw that the teachers who were great at that in school buildings tended to be teachers like art teachers or music teachers or physical education teachers, coaches, because in the moment they're kind of yelling at kids, not yelling, sorry, I'm bringing my own experience as an art student into play. But they'll come in and say oh, that's perfect, just like that. Or, hey, let me show you how you could do that a little better. Try it like this right now. The teachers who were the worst at that kind of response were reading and writing teachers. Because what we tend to do is take things home, walk to our house, right? Put that knapsack in the corner where it stares at us somewhat guiltily and grade them as soon as we can, which may not be as often as the kids need. So feedback needs to be as immediate as possible. And I think when we're talking about transferring a skill, like kids learned how to interpret a text in one unit, and now they're going to be asked to do it with greater independence in this book or this situation, that they need a couple different kinds of check-ins to have that work go well. We've got the chart up on the wall, their strategies are accessible to them, but they probably will benefit from a one-on-one conference with you to just ask and talk and explore and assess how that work's going, what kids are using, what they aren't using, what strategies are giving them trouble, and some guidance from you to be able to show them things they could do to make their work even stronger than it already is, and to give them a lot of high fives for what they're trying already. But conferences are the only thing they need. And I think the thing about transferring learning that's so powerful is that it doesn't take that much from us to get kids to feel a sense of responsibility and urgency. And so when I talk about checking in with kids, my classroom experiences, I had like 36 kids in a class, 8th graders, 3 classes of kids, which isn't that much. We had double blocks. We were really lucky. There was no way that I was going to be able to do deep, profound one-on-one conferences with all of my kids. That was an unreasonable goal for me. So instead, like one of the ways that I organize my time is I realized that there would be time that I would confer and pull small groups, which we'll talk about in a second. But that I also was going to have to do this other kind of interacting with my kids, which I wound up just calling waitressing. Like, that, yeah, I was going to have profound conversations with my students, but there were times that I just needed to kind of move around the room and like make sure everyone's okay and that they have everything that they need and that they have the little nudges that they need to get going, right? I think this is really natural for us as educators. We know we have to do this. But sometimes we feel in a rush to get to the one-on-one conferences. So I just gave myself in the classroom, and still do if I can, 5 to 10 minutes of just pure waitressing time. And to me, like that is the perfect time to check in with kids and how they're transferring skills from another unit or another experience into this one. Because all it takes is going up to a student being like, hey, how's it going? Are you checking in with that chart of strategies? How are you going to practice that today? Is it going to fit into your work? But without those check-ins, I think kids are going to have a hard time. So one, they need a real conversation with you to explore how that work from earlier teaching is going now. To give them strategies they might not have, to encourage them to use the ones that they do know. But they also, are going to need a kind of just consistent voice saying, hey, remember? Hey, remember? Hey, don't forget that skill. Hey, look at that chart. Hey, don't forget to talk to your partner about the old skill that you're carrying forward from before. So conferences, waitressing, and then I do think this is a place where small groups can be really powerful. If you teach multiple classes of kids where a bell rings at any point or a silent bell rings, which is always sort of amazing and creepy to me at the same time, then the power of small groups, whether you interact with them all the time or not, that for me in my classroom, like the only way that I was going to really meaningfully differentiate my kids is if I grouped them as much as possible. But I was really resistant to that because it felt really hard. And I think one place where small groups can be really powerful is in this context of I'm going to pull small groups to have kids check in with each other and me with how well they're transferring that list of strategies of past teaching into their work. To just check in with each other and suggest strategies, give each other the high fives. So that can sometimes loosen up that small group where sometimes I feel like my small groups all have to have a sort of precious snowflake, amazing lesson ready for them that day. And that's not a sustainable practice for me. So instead, I want to think, how can I use the structure that's really powerful of small group instruction in a way that's going to help me to meet my goal, which is that kids are transferring their learning from an earlier unit or an earlier experience into this day. And a kind of check-in small group structure can be helpful for that. Okay, so one, we use reminders. We have charts up, visual cues. 2, we make sure that we have a system of checking in, both a deep check-in like a conference, a quick check-in like waitressing, and then a sort of in-between peer-led check-in, like small groups. The third thing when we're transferring learning from one experience to another is that we want to make sure that we have a structure in place for repeated practice, where I can see as the teacher where you tried to apply that old, for lack of a better word, skill in this current unit or incarnation. And one good example I have for that is when we're reading. I think that's where it's the hardest to see evidence of a kid transferring work from an earlier unit into this one. Because as many people smarter than me have said, it's invisible, it's hard to see what kids are doing. If I don't have that time to have one-on-one deep conferences every single day with every kid really regularly, I get this feeling sometimes like things are slipping through the cracks and I'm not really sure what's happening. The kids are reading, which I'm super stoked about, and that's great. But when I'm adding that need to find out what they're thinking, it can get tricky. So in those cases, if I want kids to transfer their learning from one day to the next, from one experience to the next, then I probably need to have a writing about reading system up and going in my classroom. And I thought I'd just show you one example. Some of you may have seen this before, but let me check this out. Hold on, la la la. Okay, so this is one system. It's an example of my reading notebook, actually, that I like to show to kids. It's on an older classroom, obviously, although the same system is true in younger classes. So the first system is on the left side of the page of the reading notebook. I do ask kids to do some annotations. I don't necessarily care whether they do it as they're reading or after they're reading, but I do have an expectation that, you know, once a reading session, they're going to do a certain amount of sticky notes, and that could be off of that list of strategies that I am asking them to transfer on interpretation, for example. So they do a certain amount of Post-its each day, and then I learned this from Jerry Mariah, an old colleague from the Reading and Writing Project. Once a week, I ask the kids to download their best Post-its on the left-hand side of their reader's notebook. That way, I'm able to collect some of them without collecting all of the Post-its, which honestly, I don't really want to see every Post-it my kids write. At the same time, I need to see some of them if I'm going to be able to respond or give them a sense of accountability to the work. The other thing I did in my class, and suggest if it resonates for you, is having kids write long about their reading. And so once a week, I would also have kids kind of take one idea that they were thinking about and then stretch that thought down the page into an entry. But essentially what a system like this does is, because this is what kids are going to do, basically, I mean, it can get a little repetitive. And certainly if this were writing about reading session, we could talk about ways to vary it up. But you see how it gives kids a place to consistently practice that set of strategies that they're supposed to transfer from one place to another. And without that structure of repeated practice, if my writing about reading is sort of random, or I don't look at any of it, or I look at all of it, or the kids aren't held to choose off of a list of strategies, I think it can be really tricky to know if they are practicing those strategies or not, and what support they might need or engagement that they're missing from the work that we're doing. Okay, so we have structures for repeated practice. The last thing is that you know, when we're giving feedback and we want kids to be transferring their learning from one experience to another, that one practice that I try to stick to is making sure that when I'm giving feedback, whether it's along the way, but certainly at the end of that experience, that I am coaching myself to keep my focus on that skill focus we identified at the beginning. In other words, it is so tempting for me as a teacher to give kids feedback across a wide range of skills. And I might, I'm not saying I wouldn't, but I want to make sure that most of my feedback is rooted in the thing that the kid is working on transferring, instead of giving them a laundry list of lots of stuff they could work on, or lots of stuff that they're great at, although compliments I can be freer with. That, you know, I kind of want to be like, hey, you're working on interpretation. How is that work going? Let me give you feedback on that thing that has been your goal. I think about it like I've been trying to up my cooking game lately. My cooking game is good, but monotonous, right? Like I make the same thing all the time. I'm like, well, it's chili day, and it's taco day, and it's baked chicken day, and those are all delicious meals. But I'm looking to branch out, and so we got this one of those meal plans where they send you ingredients and recipes, and you cook a thing, and all the stuff is all pre-portioned. It's really amazing. And I did it, and I made this amazing cashew chicken dish, right? And then I decided I wanted to transfer what I'd learned from that cashew chicken dish into another similar kind of stir-fry-y thing. And when I finished, I used all of these strategies. Like I had a skills focus. I knew I couldn't do the recipe perfectly, but I did think I could transfer some of the seasoning techniques and the chopping techniques that I could play around with. I used reminders. So I had the recipe there, right? I had a list of stuff. I had check-ins and confirmations. I mean, I looked at that recipe like a million times. I had repeated practice. My family was ready to eat the meal. And at the end of that meal, when I served it, my wife, who's a good teacher, knew that what I was working on were the seasoning and making sure that it was put together right. And so she gave me feedback on that. She's like, the seasoning is delicious. Now, I knew that there were other things horribly wrong with it, but she didn't mention those things because she was like, that's not going to be helpful to you because I know what you were working on was this piece. My son, who's 3.5, who is not a very good teacher, complained about the carrots being mushy. And while he was right, like that wasn't a particularly helpful piece of feedback for me because I wasn't working on the carrots being cooked perfectly. Actually, son, I was working on the seasoning. But luckily, I know that he likes to eat pinches of salt straight from the dish, so I don't trust him for my cooking self-esteem. The point being that when we're getting feedback, if we want it to be helpful, we want feedback on the thing that we're focusing on, not all the other stuff that might be hidden and not as great or amazing about our work. This comes up a ton in writing where, I know a kid's working on elaboration. But man, I look at that piece and all I want to do is to go into convention land or craft moves or something. And while I could do that, in my mind, what I'm doing then is setting up a whole other focus for kids to learn and then transfer into their writing that I then want to enter into. Just giving them the feedback at the end isn't going to be helpful. It's kind of like critiquing a wedding dress on the wedding day. It's not really the time. So instead, I want to pull back and think, okay, what is the focus of this transfer experience? Okay, interpretation or elaboration, and then make sure that we root our feedback in that as much as possible. Okay, so when I'm thinking about my year, I have to teach new things, but I also want to make sure that kids are carrying that stuff forward that I've taught in the past. And so, for every unit, what I can ask myself is, what is the skill I want to teach that's new, right? Or the skills I want to teach that are new versus the stuff I'm going to cover. But that I can also name for myself, is there anything from the past unit or the past year or last year that I also want the kids to transfer in to this unit? So if I'm doing a lit essay unit, I could say, okay, the new skill I want kids to take on is elaboration. We're going to fill in these parts. But I do want them still to transfer all that stuff they learned about developing a claim and structuring their essay and finding good evidence. And so I'm going to make sure that I have charts up with those strategies on there, that I'm giving kids the reminders to use those strategies that they used last year. Maybe I'd even give them a copy of their old essay that they wrote before so that they could use that as a model, all the while that I'm teaching them the new stuff that I want them to take on. And in my experience so far of tackling this problem that has plagued me for years in my teaching, when I take the time as a teacher to identify those two kind of goals from the unit, the new stuff and what's the thing that we're carrying in from past teaching, kids jump up to the level of work that they were able to do before faster. And I don't feel quite so much like I'm starting from scratch every time I start a new unit. Instead, I'm saying, you guys already know how to do a bunch of stuff. Here's the support I'm going to give you to be able to practice that old work. Now, let's add things to your repertoire. So I hope that's helpful. There's more of this. This is a section of a chapter in my new book, A Novel Approach, if you're interested in looking more of that. And please feel free to reach out with any questions as they arise on Twitter at TeachKate or on our website at kateandmaggie.com. All right. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Kate, for that amazing session. Wanted to remind everyone to keep tweeting, and a reminder about our adopted charity, No Kid Hungry. Remember to pay the joy forward. Next up is session 3 workshops. Maggie Roberts, Joseph Teague, Aubrey, and Caitlin. It's going to be great. Thanks.